Hello everyone, welcome to 2018 Spring Parents Dyslexia Summit. Our guest today is Maria Toglia. Maria is a certified school psychologist. She works for years as an outpatient therapist with children, adolescents, and families, and for the past 10 years as a school psychologist working with students in early intervention through grade 12. As a parent of a child with a learning difference and ADHD, Maria not only has professional experience working on behalf of students and their families, but also she brings the perspective that comes with watching one's own child struggle, advocating for that child, and supporting him through his educational process. Thank you so much, Maria, for being on the summit.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Cheatham.
Maria, today's discussion will be focused on the evaluation process, which is often the first step for many parents. So, and also this step is repeated throughout the years because the evaluation would need to be renewed every 3 years, or even if needed, even more frequently.
Right.
So I'm really excited to hear your perspective on evaluation, what it includes, and what parents should be watching out for. And this will be a great summit, I think. Thank you so much again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be able to provide that information. It can be a very arduous process and intimidating from a parental perspective if you haven't had any experience with this, and most parents have not. So I'm happy to provide this information.
So I believe you have slides to share. Would you like to start with that?
I will.
That's great.
So the evaluate, do you want me to just go ahead and speak, Cheatham, or do you want
Sure, you can do that. I think the presentation includes also the questions we had, so that would be great.
Okay, great. So the evaluation process is, in the public education, a multidisciplinary evaluation, which means that there are multiple people providing information for that evaluation. Teachers, parents, different staff members, such as occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, even healthcare providers. So you're getting information from multiple sources in one document, and the purpose of the evaluation is to determine whether a student meets criteria for special education. That is the primary purpose of an evaluation in public schools. Now, sometimes parents find that they need to go outside and get a private evaluation for whatever reason. Sometimes their public school will not provide the evaluation for them and they need to do it themselves. Sometimes they're not feeling comfortable with the way the school is approaching the evaluation. In any case, for all evaluations that are going to be considered for special education, they need to be performed by a psychologist, a certified school psychologist. That is really the only person who can pull all the information together and make the kinds of recommendations that are required for these evaluations. There is a legal component to them. Evaluations in this state are driven by Chapter 14, which is part of the Pennsylvania Code. And this is in turn driven by educational law at the federal level with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act from 2004. So it has to be done in a very specific way, in a very specific format. Now, when you go outside and you get a private evaluation, you have to keep in mind that the school is only obligated to consider that evaluation. They don't have to take those results and use them and perform all the recommendations that are made. They only have to consider those results. So that's something that parents need to understand. But if the school themselves is doing the evaluation, the purpose is to ensure that students with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education, get what they need in the classroom. So students are referred in various ways. Now here in Pennsylvania, there is something called child find that is written into Pennsylvania law, which indicates that school districts are responsible for looking for and identifying students with disabilities. It is the school's responsibility. So typically there are either child study teams or student assistant teams, and that's their job, to look at the performance of students and to determine which students require evaluations. Referrals can come from teachers, school counselors. Obviously, parents can refer their students for evaluations. Sometimes these recommendations are made by pediatricians or other professionals. In any case, when a child has been referred, a permission to evaluate form has to be issued by the school, and it has to be done within 10 days from parent request. So if a parent picks up the phone and says to their guidance counselor, I want an evaluation for my son, that parent should hear within 10 calendar days from the school. And it should either be a permission to evaluation form that comes in the mail, or it should be a notice of recommended educational placement that describes why the school is not going to do the evaluation. They have to provide some kind of rationale. But in any case, an evaluation cannot be begun until the permission to evaluate form is signed and received. And then the evaluation has to be completed within 60 calendar days. So there's all kinds of information that's collected in the multidisciplinary evaluation. Of course, there's information from the parent, which is very important. I think the developmental information and health history information is crucial. You know, how did that child proceed through their developmental milestones in language and motor development, social emotional development. Also, the health history is very pertinent. And the history of the presenting problem. Has it always been this way? Is it changed? Does it look different? Why now? Why are you asking for this evaluation now? Information from teachers, of course. So how is that student performing in the classroom? Are they able to follow the routine? Are they keeping up with the curriculum? Are they able to work with their peers? How are they doing on the assessments that are being performed in class? Then, of course, an observation. I always feel it's important to do an observation in at least one class, maybe more, to see for myself what the child looks like in the classroom, whether he or she is sitting still, whether they're having trouble focusing, what they look like when they are asked to perform specific academic tasks, whether they're able to follow along, whether they're raising their hand or participating, or sinking back and not wanting to participate. All of this information is important. I always do a record review, so looking at any previous test data. There's lots of standardized testing that's going on now in schools, and that's actually informative when you review and see how the child has looked all along. Sometimes schools are doing screening assessments like the DIBELS early on in kindergarten and first grade. That information can be very important. So any test data that is available is also very important. And then, of course, my own test data, the assessment data that I get myself that we'll be talking about next. So what are we assessing in an educational evaluation? I always start with cognitive skills and intelligence, because these are the underlying thinking skills that drive learning and affect the way a student processes information, understands information, and uses it to solve problems. And this includes also executive function skills and memory skills, and I'll talk in detail about that in a second. Also want to look at academic achievement. So in all subject areas. So for dyslexia, clearly you're going to be taking a very close look at the child's reading skills. Also written expression skills, reading skills, and written expression skills are closely tied together. And also math skills. So we're looking at all the core subjects. I also like to look at oral expression skills and receptive language skills, because language skills are so closely tied to reading performance. And if I see deficits in these areas, then I will often make a recommendation that the student is also assessed by the speech and language therapist. So you do a detailed academic achievement assessment. and also look at social, emotional, and behavioral factors. And even if the primary referral question is academic, I think it's very important that you look at the whole child, that you look at social skills, you look at, again, classroom functioning, whether the child's self-concept is being affected, mood, anxiety, things like this, because it's very common for students who are struggling with learning to also have difficulties that may not be severe, but also be affecting the way that they view themselves or their mood. So taking a look at cognitive skills is very important, not so much because you're interested in the full scale IQ, which a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on. I'm interested in looking at the various aspects of cognitive skills. And I think most important is the verbal comprehension section of an intellectual assessment, because verbal comprehension is a very strong predictor for overall academic achievement, because without the ability to understand verbal and language-based concepts, students are going to struggle, because everything in school is taught from a language base. Instruction is language-based, obviously reading is language-based. So we're looking at a child's reasoning skills, their ability to make sense of verbal information and use that information to solve problems. Vocabulary knowledge is essential. So a student needs to understand the meaning of words and also have a good, solid background knowledge. Background knowledge is what you know about the world, what you've learned not only in school, but just incidental knowledge that you pick up day to day being in the world. So vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge are actually excellent predictors of reading comprehension. So it's very important to understand those skills in students. I also want to look at perceptual reasoning skills. So a student's ability to reason without language, often using symbols, sometimes numbers, abstract patterns, the ability to look at these patterns and recognize them and solve problems. Very much connected to what we call fluid reasoning, which is a child's ability to look at novel problems, problems that they've never seen before, and solve those problems as well. Looks at a child's cognitive flexibility in that regard. Working memory is crucial. So we use our working memory all day long. It's our ability to keep multiple pieces of information in our minds and using that information to either manipulate, make sense of, and respond to whatever needs are in the academic environment. And then processing speed is the ability to look at information on a page. So visually scan what is on a page and process it at a sufficient rate, but also accurately. Okay, so these are the areas that are in the most typical intellectual assessment, which is the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. There are other measures that are used. The Woodcock-Johnson is also used, the Stanford-Binet. All of these instruments take a look at these types of skills because they give you an understanding of how the child is approaching learning in terms of their own skill set. I think it's also very important to look at executive function skills in particular. This is the ability to purposely carry out goal-directed behavior. So planning and completing schoolwork, for example, requires tremendous executive function control, following directions. And this is all happening in prefrontal cortex, which of course is not fully developed in children, but it really affects learning. There are all different aspects of executive function. So your ability to inhibit your impulses, control your emotions, think flexibly, plan your approach to tasks, get started, self-monitor whether or not you're doing something the way that the teacher asked you to do it, looking at your own accuracy, whether it's complete, using your working memory to complete these tasks, and then also taking in and using feedback from others in an effective way and making adjustments. And this information can be gotten from cognitive assessment directly, but also through formal behavior rating scales that teachers can fill out, parents can fill out, and also students can fill out their self-reports about what they think about their own executive function skills. Now, when it comes to academic achievement, I think it's important to do a full battery, especially on the initial assessment, looking at all aspects of academic achievement. So with regard to dyslexia, of course, you want to look at reading on all aspects of reading. So phonics is very important. So the ability for a child to sound out words they don't know. Often you use nonsense words for this. Word reading, so the extent to which a student has developed a sight word vocabulary and can read those words automatically. Also want to look at fluency, the ability to read accurately with sufficient speed. And then of course, comprehension. Can you understand what you're reading? Can you answer questions about that? Can you make inferences about that? Can you connect it to what you've already learned about the subject, or pull what you know about the world into affecting that comprehension of text? Phonological processing is extremely important. It's the ability to hear and manipulate the sounds involved in words. So letter sounds in particular, understanding rhyming words, being able to identify the initial sound in words, the ending sounds, the middle sounds, rapid naming, which is the ability to look at a letter and know it right away, that efficiency and automaticity that happens with skilled readers. If I think that there are significant deficits in phonological processing, especially if a student has a history of early language delays, so late talkers, for example, I will often get the speech and language therapist involved because it makes sense to do a full language assessment, speech and language assessment for that student, since language and reading are so intimately connected. Of course, you want to look at math. So calculation skills, math facts, fluency, problem solving. Lots of kids with dyslexia end up having difficulty with math. Not all children do, but some do. And it's very common for kids with dyslexia to have difficulty memorizing math facts. It's just a pattern that we see commonly. Written expression, of course, is intimately tied in with language and also with reading. So spelling, which is affected by your phonics and your ability to understand spelling patterns. Sentence writing, so the underlying grammar that goes into sentence writing, the rules of the English language, of course, that drive grammar, sentence writing, essay writing, and your ability to generate sentences pretty fluently. Also want to look at oral expression, as I said, so your ability to express in words what you know about vocabulary. And then listening comprehension, being able to hear information that's spoken aloud, use that information to solve problems, understand it and solve problems. These are all important areas of academic achievement that affect learning. So I also look at social emotional aspects. I always ask for permission to do that from parents, because if you don't look for it, you don't find it. And kids are complex, and they're often, if they're stressed because they're having difficulty learning, there might be something else going on that needs attention. So I'm going to look at all of these areas that I have on this slide. And depending on what I see observationally, and depending on what I'm hearing from teachers and parents, I will use various formal behavior rating scales that will give me specific information that I might need to rule out different problems that happen with kids. Things like ADHD, anxiety, depression, difficulty with social skills, things that we might need to address in the learning environment, as well as academic problems. Like I said, I will sometimes recommend related service assessments like speech and language. Sometimes a student who's having difficulty with writing will need an occupational therapy assessment. So if they're really struggling with handwriting, copying from the board, or managing text on a page, it's really a good idea to get an occupational therapist's assessment of that child. Sometimes kids are also having difficulty with gross motor skills, and that's the physical therapy aspect of it that sometimes we need to have assessed. For students who have vision, hearing, or difficulties with central auditory processing, the intermediate unit is often the source for those evaluations. So it's the school's responsibility to then contact the intermediate unit and get those professionals involved to do those types of assessments when they're necessary, depending on what the presenting problem looks like and whether there's a history of difficulty with vision and hearing. So what are we looking for in an assessment? We're basically looking for a pattern of strengths and needs. So what is the child good at? Where are they doing well? And then where are they also having difficulty? And you want to really be able to describe that in detail for parents so that they understand why are they having trouble in class, or why are they excelling in one area and having difficulty in another area. You really want to connect this pattern of strengths and needs to the referral question so that parents and teachers understand what is affecting the student's learning. You want to look at, is this student making meaningful progress? That's sort of the legal term that we are applying to determine whether a student is going to require special education. If the child is not making meaningful progress, and in my mind that means performing at the level expected for his or her age and grade, then we want to look at whether or not that student needs modifications or accommodations in the regular education curriculum. Do they need something different? And then you have to create a basis, make an argument for making those kinds of recommendations. So specific learning disability has a very long definition here in the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm not going to read it completely, but as you go through it, you will see that it includes all those areas of academic functioning that I meant, or that I described. So oral expression is in there, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math calculation, math problem solving. If there are problems in any of these areas, then we have to consider specific learning disability for a child. Now, you're not going to necessarily hear the word dyslexia used in public schools, although there's no reason that we can't use this word. But a lot of school psychologists are hesitant to use the word dyslexia. Instead, you're going to see the phrase specific learning disability in reading if a student is presenting with a pattern of dyslexia. But dyslexia itself, we know, includes deficits in phonological processing, so difficulty manipulating sounds, as I described before, difficulty with phonics, so the alphabetic principle, which is the ability to understand the relationship between letters themselves and their sounds. Fluency problems, so difficulty reading sufficiently at a sufficient rate with good accuracy, comprehension difficulties. Kids with dyslexia often have slow processing speed, so it's very hard for them to look at information on a page and process it in an efficient way. They need extra time. And it's very common to see kids with dyslexia to have had language delays early on, and to also have difficulty with working memory. Working memory affects all learning, and it's not unusual at all to see difficulty with working memory in students who have dyslexia or specific learning disability in reading. Now, the determination of specific learning disability has a number of criteria that the state expects us to look at. And one is the student performing at the level expected for his or her grade and age? Now, each district should have a specific way in which they determine SLD written in their policies somewhere for you to look at. It can be a little different in each district. So some districts want a certain level of discrepancy between the full scale IQ and a child's score on an academic achievement test. Some districts are more lenient and are just looking for that pattern of strengths and needs, showing that the child is not at the level expected for their age and grade. It differs from district to district. So you really do want to ask the question in your district, how do you determine specific learning disability? We need to address information about instruction. Has that student been instructed appropriately? Have they received instruction that includes the 5 essential components of essential reading instruction? So phonological processing, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency. We also have to look at environmental effects. Is there something going on in the child's environment that's affecting their learning? We also have to look at whether the child's been taught by qualified teachers. You need information that's been provided to the parents all along, test information like standardized testing, observations, the classroom observation I described, and something called exclusionary findings. So you can't determine that a student has a specific learning disability if that child, A, has not been taught properly by qualified teachers, if that child is not proficient in the English language, if that child is actually found to have an intellectual disability. Sometimes children with emotional disturbance, that's the better explanation for why they're not performing academically. Sometimes environmental effects are the better explanation for why a student isn't performing academically. So we have to look at all of these factors before we determine that, yes, in fact, it is a specific learning disability and not something else. So as I said, you have to look at what your district does. Do they use the discrepancy model as I described? Some districts, although they're few and far between here in Pennsylvania, use something called response to intervention, where they use increasingly complex interventions with students in the regular education curriculum. And if the student does not respond appropriately to those interventions, then they call a student learning disabled. But as I said, that's not used very often because it's a pretty difficult process and you have to have a lot of things in place that many schools do not have in place. You're more commonly going to find the discrepancy model. Go ahead, Tatum, do you have questions?
So when you say this in Pennsylvania, would that apply to the rest of the country as well?
Yes. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act says that you do not have to use the discrepancy model. So that freed up districts around the country to use the response to intervention way of approaching specific learning disability identification. Now, it's used at different levels in different states. I know here in Pennsylvania, there are only a few districts that use it, and you have to go through a very specific process to make sure that you have all of the things in place to use it properly. Now, there are other states that might be much farther along in response to intervention, but you have to look specifically in your district to see what they're doing.
Thank you.
So in terms of interventions, after you have determined a student requires specially designed instruction, then the report needs to make recommendations about what has to happen in the classroom for that student to meet their learning needs. And they need to be directly related to the needs that you've identified from the testing. So they need to be specific, and the instructional strategies should be clear so that a teacher can look at it and understand exactly what it is that he or she should be doing. And we also need to make sure that we're providing interventions for students in what we call the least restrictive environment. Anytime we can push supports into the regular education curriculum, we should do that, but there are also going to be times when we can't push those interventions in and a child might have to be pulled out into a special learning situation. So for reading, students with dyslexia or SLD in reading, they need, we know, systematic multisensory phonics-based reading instruction that includes the 5 essential components: phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. We know this, the science of reading is very clear. We understand what needs to be done. There are several different programs out there that provide this type of intervention, but this is what needs to happen. Students with comprehension also need direct instruction in comprehension strategies, but they also need instruction to build their vocabulary knowledge and their background knowledge, because we understand now that these 2 areas are very important predictors for comprehension. It's not just the way you approach the text, it's the information you already have in your head about word knowledge and background knowledge. So writing interventions are often very important for students. So these kids need explicit instruction in grammar, mechanics, and sentence and paragraph writing. They need to learn how to explicitly plan and write a sentence. They need to practice summarizing text. That's an excellent way of practicing writing information. Writing collaboratively with peers is very effective. Setting specific goals for writing, using a word processor instead of writing by hand is often really important for kids, especially kids who have difficulty with handwriting or spelling. It really helps them to be able to type it out because their spelling mistakes are pointed out right away by the computer, and they can learn how to use spell check. It also just bypasses the difficulty with messy handwriting that a lot of kids have. So kids need to understand how to combine sentences. They need lots of opportunities with teacher feedback, pre-writing activities like brainstorming and graphic organizers. And they need to see a model of good writing. They need to understanding what good writing looks like. They need to read something that a teacher considers to be an exemplary example. Lots of kids have difficulty with math and need interventions in math. And again, they need that systematic and explicit instruction in math problem solving and procedures with visual representations and lots of examples and lots of practice. Again, working with peers, modified instruction, opportunities to think aloud while you're working, while you're problem solving with, and also create visual representations. And being able to learn strategies like reading a word problem, highlighting, solving, and checking back. So understanding strategies like that. So these are just a small number of interventions that are that can be useful for students in the classroom. So that's my presentation. If you have other questions, Sheeta might be happy to answer them.
So I have a few questions. So when you say about like math facts, that's always something that I'm curious about. Like how do you have any tips that you could give to the parents? I don't know if that would be in your expertise, but that just kind of came to my mind. Like how could kids who have difficulty memorizing their math facts could get better at them?
Right. I remember doing it with my son using those triangular cards that introduce math facts in number families, so numbers that are related to each other. So you're helping kids connect multiplication, division, and addition, and how they are related to each other. Because a lot of the times, the difficulty kids have with math facts is not just the memorization part, but understanding the relationship between numbers, how numbers are related to each other. So for those of us who understand math facts pretty easily, we understand that 2 and 4 are related. You double 2 and you get 4, okay? 2 times 2 is 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Those kinds of relationships. And there are cards that are created, flashcards, that are actually, they're triangular, and they're actually very useful. So repetition is important. Kids with difficulty with math facts, they just need repetition. There's no other way around it. You have to do it over and over and over. But what I find is at a certain point, if the student has tried and tried and tried, and they still can't call up those math facts easily, give that kid a calculator, because it's really going to interfere with that child's ability to perform more complex math as they get into the curriculum and at higher levels. You don't want them stopping and not being able to continue to problem solve because they can't figure out what 6 times 7 is. Give that kid a calculator.
Oh, that's great advice.
Yes. People are sometimes, hesitant to do that, but after the student has tried, it's just going to result in frustration.
Yeah, I feel like, as an adult, I have access to calculator, and that doesn't really, limit how much math I have learned. It's,
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's sometimes giving these accommodations to get them over those little hurdles they have that stop them from achieving their potential.
Yes,
Be the
absolutely.
solution.
Oh,
I know some people, and I felt that way early on too. I said, oh, I don't want to give these crutches to the kids. To my son, I wanted him to learn. But now, as we go through the journey, I realize that, just giving a little bit of support, that could make such a big difference.
Exactly. And you have to
Exactly.
prioritize what you think is important.
Yeah.
Is it
Hmm.
more important that the child understands the concepts behind the math, or is it more important that they can really just spout off those math facts? I think it's more important that they understand the concepts and the problem solving strategies.
For sure. Once we're out of school, it's all, the whole world has all the accommodations for us.
That's
And
right.
it's making the connections and the critical thinking that really differentiates successful people, I think.
Oh, I agree with you.
Not what the math facts are, right?
No, no, not at all. And I mean, that's true also
Yeah.
for vocabulary knowledge as well. So some kids also are really having trouble just remembering what different words mean. And I often say, well, then that child should have a journal or something that they can refer to with words and their meanings so that they can look it up. Because it's taxing their working memory, first of all, increasing their frustration. And when you increase frustration, then there's the potential for raised anxiety. And once you have elevated anxiety, you can't think very straight. So anytime a student is struggling with some aspect of memorization, give that child some support in that area. It's the idea of a crutch. I don't like that word because I don't. It's not really explaining what we're doing. I like what you said. It's accommodating. You're accommodating the difference and freeing up that child's energy, that cognitive energy, for thinking about more complex things, not just the things that they need to memorize.
For sure. I wish I had that when I was growing up too.
Me too.
Would
Me
have made
too.
my life easier as a student. Well, thank you so much for being with us again on the summit. I will also put the link of our previous summit. You were a guest on that as well, and it also touched on evaluations and a
Great.
little bit further in depth. So I'll make sure that link is in the bottom as well. Thank
Okay.
you so much again.
Thank you,
It's
Cheetah.
always great talking with you.
Nice talking with you too. Take
Thank you.
care.